Mechanic let go after 3 decades of service. After several weeks, he makes his return, and an eerie stillness envelopes the crowd. For 3 decades, Frank Sullivan dedicated his life to the same garage. 3 decades of oil-smeared hands, bruised knuckles, and countless late nights spent beneath the car's hood. He transformed that space from the ground up, evolving a modest auto shop into one of the most reputable names in the city. Clients sought more than just repairs. They arrived with the confidence that Frank would uphold his integrity. Yet none of that held significance today, for today he was being discarded like refuse. Frank stood before Greg Miller's desk, the new proprietor of the shop since the passing of Old Man Carter. Greg was youthful, impeccably dressed, and prioritized profit margins over the well-being of others. He reclined in his lavish chair, rhythmically tapping his pen on the desk. "I apologize, Frank. Commerce is commerce." His tone was relaxed, as if he were casually requesting Frank to hand him the salt during a meal. Frank tightened his jaw. 3 decades, Greg. I trained a significant portion of the team in that shop. I maintained this place while Carter was unwell. So, you're really just gonna let me walk away? Greg let out a weary sigh, as if the weight of the world rested on his shoulders. Listen, your skills are truly impressive, without a question. However, the times are shifting. Younger mechanics are essential for our needs. They can work more efficiently and accept lower pay rates. I have stakeholders to respond to. This is not about personal feelings. Not personal. Frank experienced a constriction in his chest, yet he was determined not to reveal it to Greg. He refused to grant him that satisfaction. What comes next? Frank inquired, his tone unwavering. Are you really asking me to gather my things and leave as if I never existed? Greg gave a nonchalant shrug. Exactly. A severance package is available, including a few months' pay. Think of it as a gesture of gratitude for your dedication. Frank exhaled slowly. His hands clenched tightly, yet he willed himself to remain composed. Greg wasn't someone to sacrifice one's dignity for. He pivoted, making his way toward the exit. Yet, just as he was about to step out, he hesitated. He glanced back, his tone subdued yet resolute. You've just made the biggest blunder of your life? Greg chuckled, shaking his head. We'll find out soon enough. Frank exited without a glance over his shoulder. When he arrived at his station, his toolbox had been neatly packed away. The name that had graced the plaque above his workspace for decades had vanished. Wiped clean. The young mechanics hardly glanced up as he passed by. Some appeared to carry the weight of guilt, while others seemed to breathe a sigh of relief that the burden was not theirs to bear. The brisk wind greeted him sharply as he ventured into the parking lot. The old truck remained in its usual place, yet there was an unmistakable shift in the air this time. He was never returning. Frank tossed his toolbox into the truck bed before climbing in. With a firm grasp on the steering wheel, he fixed his gaze straight ahead. 3 decades of his existence vanished in an instant. With a decisive twist, he engaged the lock. The engine roared into action. He was completely unaware of what awaited him. Frank navigated through the night, the city lights merging into a kaleidoscope of colors beyond his windshield. His grip on the wheel was firm, his knuckles pale with tension. 3 decades spent in a single location, and now he found himself without a destination. The idea smoldered within him, an unquenchable flame that refused to be extinguished. He had not merely lost a job, he had lost his very sense of purpose. He finally eased into the driveway of his modest home, the very place he had called his own for 2 decades. The porch light danced erratically as he emerged from the truck, toolbox clutched firmly in his grasp. Within the confines, the stillness struck him profoundly. Silence enveloped the space, devoid of the hum of machinery, the scent of grease or steel, leaving only a profound void. He placed his toolbox on the kitchen table and settled into a chair. His fingers sifted through his silver-streaked locks. This was never part of his plan. He had always envisioned retiring from that garage, perhaps mentoring a new generation, sharing the wisdom he had accumulated over the years. Yet, in mere seconds, Greg had snatched that away from him. His gaze fell upon a vintage photograph displayed on the wall. He and Carter, the original proprietor of the shop, stood before the garage on the day it first opened its doors. Carter had transcended the role of a mere boss. He was a guiding figure, a companion, a person who valued dedication and faithfulness. Were he to witness the present, he would surely feel a deep sense of disappointment regarding the events that have unfolded. Frank tightened his jaw and averted his gaze. He had to determine his next steps. At dawn, he rose early, driven by routine. His body had adapted to the rhythm, donning his clothes, making his way to the shop, laboring until his hands throbbed. Yet today, there was no destination in sight. He lingered at the kitchen table, a steaming cup of black coffee in front of him, his gaze fixed on his weathered hands. He had always been devoted to this singular pursuit. Suddenly, an idea flickered in his mind. He picked up his phone and flicked through his contacts list. Surely, there was someone out there, a shop, or perhaps an old friend in need of a mechanic's skills. One by one, he announced the numbers. One after another, he received the identical response. Currently, we are not looking to fill any positions. Financial constraints are present. We will remember you. Frank let out a sharp breath, placing the phone on the table. He had never experienced such a profound sense of inadequacy before. That afternoon, he cruised through the town, pausing at every shop he encountered. In certain areas, there were young individuals just fresh from their studies laboring in the bays. Others had owners who viewed his age as a burden rather than a benefit. Time slipped away, and with each refusal, his optimism faded further. While parked in his truck near the final shop on his itinerary, something drew his attention. A dilapidated garage, tucked away on the outskirts of town. The sign had lost its vibrancy, its words a mere whisper, and the lot lay desolate. However, Frank was familiar with the name. It had once been in the possession of a seasoned mechanic he was familiar with, a figure who had been around for just as long as he had. He drove into the lot, a sense of intrigue pulling at him. The structure appeared deserted, yet the entrance stood ajar. Within the confines of the space, chaos reigned supreme. Tools shrouded in dust, cars left to decay, and a palpable sense of abandonment. The place appeared untouched, as if time had stood still for ages. Suddenly, a thought ignited within him. For 3 decades, he dedicated himself to the growth of another's enterprise. Perhaps the moment had come to create something of his own. Frank found himself in the heart of the dusty garage, his boots anchored resolutely on the fractured concrete floor. The atmosphere was thick with the scent of aged oil and unfulfilled promise. He glided his hand across a weathered toolbox, his fingers following the contours of something that had once held significance, but had succumbed to decay. He sensed it deep within him. This location was steeped in history, the sort that could not be purchased, only acquired through experience. For years, he had poured his heart and effort into transforming Greg's shop into the finest establishment in town. And where had that led him? Cast away, overlooked. Yet this location, it felt unique. Frank approached the garage door and forcefully pushed it open. The sunlight poured through, casting a warm glow on the dust dancing in the air. He could nearly envision it as it might become. Vehicles queued outside, as individuals arrived with their cars, seeking the assurance of a trusted hand. A mechanic who would remain honest with them. His very own establishment. The idea sent a rush of adrenaline through him. However, the truth began to dawn. It was a disaster. The machinery was antiquated, the elevator bore signs of corrosion, and one could only wonder if the wiring was functional at all. It would require more funds than he possessed merely to get it operational. And then emerged the most significant challenge. Clients. How could he earn the community's trust for a new shop when Greg's enterprise dominated the entire town? Many of Frank's former patrons continued to frequent the place, and Greg ensured that each one departed satisfied. Frank let out a deep breath, his hand moving to massage the back of his neck. Perhaps this was an error in judgment. Perhaps he was merely pursuing an illusion that was destined to remain out of reach. Suddenly, the unmistakable sound of tires crunching against the pavement reached his ears. His stomach tightened. This place is meant to be empty. He emerged into the open air and noticed an elderly gentleman descending from a weathered pickup truck. His attire was tattered, his visage marked by time, yet Frank identified him without hesitation. Tom Reed. Frank hadn't laid eyes on him in years, yet he had once been an icon in the field. Once, he ran a shop that drew visitors from far and wide, all aware of his unmatched expertise. Frank had gained invaluable insights from observing his craft. Tom propped himself against the truck, casting a knowing smirk at Frank. Rumor has it you've been shown the door. Frank folded his arms across his chest. Information spreads quickly. Tom let out a soft laugh. It inevitably happens in a place like this. His eyes wandered over to the garage. What's the strategy moving forward? Frank paused, uncertainty flickering in his mind. I'm uncertain whether I possess one. Tom let out a derisive laugh. That doesn't resemble the Frank Sullivan I'm familiar with. You are the finest mechanic in this town. I have always been. Frank exhaled slowly. Even if I renovate this space, it seems unlikely that anyone will show up. Greg has already claimed them all. Tom nodded, a knowing look on his face, as if he had anticipated that response all along. He strolled to the rear of his truck, raised the tailgate, and retrieved a worn toolbox. Let's make a change. Frank scowled. Are we? Tom smiled broadly. Though I may have some years behind me, I still navigate engines with ease, and I possess something that Greg lacks. Frank arched an eyebrow. Tom gently tapped the toolbox. Devoted patrons who have been anticipating a reason to depart from that establishment. Frank sensed a flicker of emotion deep within him. This might just be the solution we need. Frank stood there, gazing at Tom, the gravity of the moment enveloping him. This was more than a fleeting exchange. Tom was serious, and after 3 decades in the mechanic trade, Frank understood that individuals like Tom didn't invest their energy in hopeless situations. Frank let out a breath, casting a look over his shoulder at the dusty garage. Do you genuinely believe that individuals will show up here? Tom wore a sly grin. They certainly will if they are aware that you are in charge of it. Individuals are weary of absurdity. They merely require a reason to turn their backs. Frank yearned to embrace that notion, yet launching a shop from scratch was undeniably a formidable challenge. It demanded funds, instruments, gear, resources he lacked. It seemed as though Tom could read his thoughts. He lifted the lid of his toolbox and retrieved a worn checkbook. I have a bit of money set aside. It's not a lot, but it's sufficient to keep this place operational. Frank's eyes grew large with surprise. Tom, I simply can't accept your money. You are not accepting it. I am putting my resources into a business that genuinely values its community. You repair the vehicles. I will take care of the business aspects. Tom placed a hand on Frank's shoulder with a firm yet friendly gesture. This will come together successfully. Frank gulped nervously. For the past fortnight, he had been engulfed in despair, convinced that his existence had reached its end. Yet, here stood Tom, offering him a glimmer of hope, a renewed opportunity. He gazed at the garage once more, envisioning it not as the dilapidated chaos it currently was, but as the bustling workshop it had the potential to become. He glanced over at Tom once more. Okay, let's get started. And just like that, the flame was ignited. In the days that followed, Frank and Tom immersed themselves in their tasks. The garage was meticulously cleaned, with every surface scrubbed free of years of dust and grime. Tom reached out to former connections, successfully finalizing agreements on pre-owned equipment. Frank dedicated countless hours to mending the corroded lift, reconfiguring the lighting, and ensuring that every aspect of the shop was in working order. Rumors began to circulate. A handful of Frank's former clients dropped in, intrigued. They observed his efforts, recalling the reasons they had placed their trust in him over the years. One morning, a woman arrived in a minivan, her expression tight with concern. I heard you were available. My car has been making a noise, but Greg's shop informed me that it would take 2 weeks just to examine it. Frank gave a slight nod. Open the hood. In just a few moments, he pinpointed the problem. a relaxed belt, a quick 10-minute solution. As he returned the keys, she stood there in disbelief. Greg informed me that a complete repair was necessary. He intended to bill me a substantial amount. Frank cleaned his hands with a rag. You're all set. There's no fee for something so minor. Her eyes brimmed with appreciation. I am sharing the news about this place with everyone. And she certainly did. Before long, an increasing number of cars began to arrive. Individuals entered expressing their frustrations about Greg's excessive charges and his insistence on unnecessary repairs. Frank and Tom dedicated themselves to their craft, repairing cars with integrity and fairness. The trust was returning. However, Greg was feeling quite discontented. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Frank secured the premises, and a sleek black luxury car glided into the lot. The door creaked open, revealing Greg as he emerged from the shadows. His expression was inscrutable, yet a fierce intensity flickered in his eyes that Frank found difficult to decipher. Greg advanced with deliberate slowness. So this is how you've been spending your time. Frank folded his arms across his chest. Your reaction suggests a sense of astonishment. Greg smirked, yet the expression held no trace of amusement. An error has been made, my dear fellow. Tom approached Frank with purpose. The sole error was believing you could sustain a business by deceiving others. Greg's jaw clenched. Your time is limited. Frank locked eyes with him. We shall see about that. With a low, sardonic laugh, Greg slipped back into his car and drove away. Tom let out a breath. He hasn't finished yet. Frank gave a slight nod. He understood Greg all too well. This is merely the start. The following morning, Frank showed up at the shop ahead of schedule, yet an unsettling feeling lingered in the air. As he approached, a knot formed in his stomach. The entrance stood ajar. The lock was broken. His heart raced as he hurried through the door. Utensils lay haphazardly in every corner. Drawers pulled wide. The register was absent. The toolbox he had cherished for decades had vanished. Tom dashed in after him, coming to an abrupt halt. Absolutely not. He surveyed the destruction, his expression hardening with fury. Frank tightened his fists. He was fully aware of the culprit behind this. Greg. That was the sole rationale. Greg had observed the shop flourishing, patrons departing from his garage to frequent this place. He had cautioned Frank that his endurance would be short-lived. And now we have this. Tom pushed a damaged chair out of his way. It's necessary for us to contact the authorities. Frank let out a quick breath, his head shaking in disbelief. There is no evidence to support that claim. He will refute all claims. Tom was seething with anger. Therefore, we simply allow this to pass. Frank surveyed the devastation, a weight settling in his chest. No, they would not allow it to be forgotten. By noon, the news had rippled through the town. Patrons entered, breathless at the condition of the store. Mrs. Carter crossed her arms, a gesture that spoke volumes. So Greg was the one who did this, right? Frank's lack of response spoke volumes. Whispers filled the air, accompanied by disapproving shakes of the head. A handful of men advanced. We will not allow him to escape the consequences of his actions. We are here to assist you in your journey of restoration. Frank felt a constriction in his throat. After dedicating 3 decades to a company that ultimately discarded him, it was remarkable to see how, in just a matter of weeks, others began to rally in his support. At the close of the day, the shop sparkled with an unprecedented cleanliness. Tools were generously donated. A new register has been dropped off. The word from the town was clear. Greg had attempted to obliterate them. Instead, he had bestowed upon them greater strength. However, Greg still had more to say. That evening, as Frank secured the premises, he observed a vehicle stationed across the street, its headlights extinguished, with a silhouette seated within, observing intently. Frank glanced over at Tom. Preparation is essential. He hasn't finished yet. The following morning, Frank showed up at the shop before dawn, his thoughts lingering on the car that had been observing them the previous night. He sensed that this was just the beginning of something much larger. Upon entering, A wave of resolve washed over him. Greg might attempt to instill fear, to shatter their resolve, yet victory would elude him. Tom showed up a few minutes later, holding 2 coffees in his hands. "Do you get any sleep?" Frank let out a soft laugh, shaking his head in amusement. "Is my mind overloaded?" Tom presented him with a cup. "Well, brace yourself because things are about to get quite hectic." Frank frowned. "Could you clarify what you mean?" Tom grinned, retrieving his phone from his pocket. "There are whispers circulating, Frank." Whispers traveled through the streets, carrying tales of the event that unfolded. They are fully aware of Greg's actions, and they have reached their limit with him. "I've been receiving messages all morning. Individuals are eager to have their vehicles repaired, and they expect you to handle it." Frank hardly had a moment to react before a car arrived. Next came one more, followed by yet another. In just a few moments, the lot was completely filled. A man approached, extending his hand to Frank in greeting. "For years, I sought Greg's guidance, but that chapter has closed. I refuse to part with my money for anyone who seeks to undermine those who are genuine." A woman stood behind him, nodding in agreement. "I feel the same way. He billed me for a repair that was completely unnecessary. I ought to have arrived here earlier." Frank gazed at the swelling throng, feeling a surge of emotion. Individuals were not merely presenting their enterprises. They were offering their confidence. For the next few hours, Frank and Tom toiled tirelessly, mending cars, swapping out oil and changing tires. With each glance upward, Frank noticed an increasing number of cars arriving. The store buzzed with a vibrancy he had never envisioned. Just as Frank finished wiping his hands on a rag, a sleek black luxury car glided into the lot, its presence unmistakable. "Greg." He emerged, his face a mask of mystery. For a brief instant, he remained still, observing the bustling store, the cheerful patrons, the vibrant energy enveloping him. He approached Frank with purpose. "Your argument is well established." Frank folded his arms across his chest. "Did I really?" Greg let out a breath, surveying his surroundings. "You dismantled all that I created." Frank shook his head in disbelief. "You have dismantled what you created. I simply provided individuals with an alternative choice." Greg fixed his gaze on him, holding the silence for what felt like an eternity. Without uttering another word, he pivoted and made his way back to his vehicle. As he drove away, Frank experienced an emotion that had eluded him for weeks. Tranquility. Tom gave him a hearty pat on the back. "Congratulations, Frank." Frank surveyed the shop, observing the people and the vibrant life they had built together. "No," he replied with a smile. "We accomplished it." This story imparts a profound lesson. In the long run, honesty and dedication prevail. Frank devoted 3 decades of his life to his profession, only to be cast aside without a moment's consideration. Yet rather than surrendering, he held firm, transformed himself, and gained the admiration of a whole community. His journey illustrates that when you act with integrity, others take notice, and support will arrive in unexpected forms. Greg, conversely, believed that power and greed would serve as his shield. He thought he could ruin a person's future without facing any repercussions. Ultimately, he found himself with nothing left. Not due to Frank's confrontation, but rather because his own deceit finally caught up with him.